Hi everyone, and welcome back to another pop-up lecture with me, Professor Osborne. This week we are stepping into one of the most famous and fascinating moments in cultural history, the Renaissance. When most people hear that word, they immediately imagine beautiful paintings, marble statues, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, grand churches, and the sense of an artistic golden age. And yes, those images are absolutely part of the story. But the Renaissance is not just about beautiful art. It represents a profound shift in how people understood human identity, human ability, and human potential. And that shift is what we are really exploring this week. When people picture the Renaissance, they often imagine a world filled with masterpieces, extraordinary paintings, monumental architecture, and artists whose names have become almost legendary. Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael. That's right, I'm talking about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. No, I'm not really. But these figures feel almost larger than life. But if we focus only on the artwork itself, we miss the deeper transformation that was happening during this time. Because the Renaissance was not simply an explosion of artistic talent, it was a cultural moment that redefined how people thought about human creativity and human achievement. At its core, the Renaissance represents a shift in perspective. People began thinking differently about what human beings were capable of accomplishing. There was a growing belief that humans could learn, create, innovate, and shape the world around them in very powerful ways. This doesn't mean that medieval people lacked this creativity or intelligence, but Renaissance thinkers placed new emphasis on human potential. And that shift leads to one of the most important questions of the entire period. The Renaissance invites us to ask a question that still matters today. What does it mean to become fully human? And maybe even more specifically, what kind of person is worth admiring? And what talents should we celebrate? What achievements should we reward? Those questions sit at the center of Renaissance culture and at the center of what we will be discussing this week as well. And they obviously still shape our world today. The word Renaissance literally means rebirth. This rebirth refers to a renewed interest in the classical world, especially the cultures of ancient Greece and Rome. Renaissance scholars rediscovered classical texts. Artists studied classical sculpture, and architects were examining Roman building techniques. The ancient world became a source of inspiration, not because people wanted to copy the past, but because they believed that these classical ideas about beauty, proportion, and intellect and civic life could help reshape their own society and overall make their lives better. One of the most important centers of this cultural transformation was Florence, Italy. Florence became a hub of Renaissance creativity, attracting artists, scholars, architects, and thinkers. But this does not happen by accident. Florence became the center of the Renaissance because the right historical conditions came together at the right time. Isn't that how it always works? Florence was a wealthy city with powerful trade networks. Remember, in Italy, you have water on three sides, right? So this gives you geographically an already step up. It has a rising merchant class because of this trade and ports. It had banking families with enormous financial resources. It had scholars who were recovering classical manuscripts, and it had patrons who were willing to invest in artistic and intellectual life. This was the beginning of the middle class. And the middle class had money for the first time ever. This is happening. And they wanted to start spending their money on things. And all of these factors helped create an environment where creativity could flourish. The Renaissance did not just simply appear, it was built. It was built by middle class money. And one of the, that is technically one of the most important things about this period is that, when I talk about the Italian Renaissance and we talk about all of these artists and architects and all of these people that came out of this time period, sometimes it's like, my goodness, what was someone, something in the water? All of these incredible people were being born? No, it did not happen like that. The Renaissance didn't just happen because there was something in the water. Maybe there was, but it was built. It was supported. It was funded. It was imagined into existence by people who actually believed that culture mattered. Great art and great ideas rarely happen in isolation. They emerge from systems that support creativity. Behind the Renaissance art were workshops, training systems, patrons, libraries, and the most important thing, money. Culture needs infrastructure. Artists need teachers. Scholars need texts. Thinkers needed time and support. The Renaissance was not just inspiration, it was organization. Now, if there is one idea that sits at the center of this week, it is this: humanism. Without humanism, there is no Renaissance as we know it. Humanism was an intellectual movement focused on the study of human life, human reasoning, human expression, and human potential. Humanism did not mean people suddenly abandoned religion, however. That is a very important detail to understand, that humanism was not anti-Christian. It was not people saying, forget God, now it's all about us. Instead, it represented a shift in emphasis. One of the most important intellectual shifts during the Renaissance was a change in emphasis about how people understood the human condition. In the medieval world, life was often framed primarily through religious ideas. Remember, we talked about that last week. Concepts like salvation, sin, divine order, humility, and the promise of the afterlife. Human life was understood largely in relation just to God's plan. The focus was on preparing spiritually, moral discipline, and the ultimate goal of eternal salvation. Now, humanism does not erase those concerns, but Renaissance thinkers, they were still deeply religious, and the church continued to play a major role in everyday life. But humanism introduced something new alongside that religious framework. Humanist scholars began asking a different set of questions about the human experience. They asked, what are human beings capable of achieving in this world? What can we learn from the history of earlier civilizations? It's what we're doing here, right? What can literature teach us about the complexity of human emotions, choices, and character? How do we cultivate wisdom, judgment, eloquence, and moral character in public life? In other words, the focus expanded from purely just preparing us for the next world to also understanding how to live meaningfully in this one. And that shift towards studying language, history, philosophy, and even human expression is what eventually gave us the foundation of what we now call the humanities. That's what it's all about. This is where we get the Studia Humanitarius. And I know that I did not say that right, but that is okay. That's where we get grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, moral philosophy. These were the subjects that these early humanists believed could help cultivate thoughtful, articulate, and reflective individuals. And these subjects eventually became the foundation of what we now call the humanities. And sometimes, students ask, why do the humanities matter? Why is Introduction to Humanities a required college course when I don't want anything to do with it? And one of the best answers that I like to give is this. The humanities emerged from a belief that human beings should not only be trained to do a job in this life, that's not all you're here to do, but you should also learn how to think. You should also learn how to interpret, to communicate, to judge, reflect, to be your own human. And that belief is a very Renaissance idea. So another major shift during the Renaissance was the rise of a new kind of identity. In the medieval world, identity was often collective. People were defined by their role within a much larger structure. You remember that the feudal system pyramid, right? With that larger, most of the people were at the very bottom. So yeah, you were defined by your role within that structure. The village you lived in, the church, the social rank, your hierarchy. But during the Renaissance, something new begins to appear. The Renaissance starts to celebrate the individual talent, individual reputation, individual achievement, and legacy. This shift shows up everywhere in portraitures, in biography. This is the first time that you actually see artists putting their signature on artwork. And in the idea that a person can shape how they will be remembered. One of the figures who captures the spirit of the Renaissance more vividly than almost anyone else is Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo becomes a kind of symbol of Renaissance identity, and not simply because he was incredibly talented, although he most certainly was a genius. I think even today, if you dropped him into 2026, he would probably still be a genius. What made Leonardo remarkable was the range of his curiosity. Leonardo was not just a painter creating works like The Last Supper or the Mona Lisa. No, I truly believe, and this is my theory, Professor Osborne's theory, is that painting was something that he did in order to fund his other loves and hobbies. He was an inventor who sketched flying machines centuries before airplanes existed. He was an engineer who was designing bridges and mechanical devices. He was an anatomist who dissected human bodies in order to understand how muscles and bones actually functioned. He studied geology, water movement, optics, and architecture. His notebooks are filled with observations, diagrams, and questions about how the natural world works. What Leonardo represents is the Renaissance fascination with the polymath. This is a person whose mind moves freely across disciplines. Someone who refuses to stay in just one category. This is a person who's interested in art and science, in imagination and analysis, in beauty and reason. The Renaissance admired people who were intellectually curious about many parts of the world. And that idea, the idea that a truly extraordinary mind explores many different fields, is exactly what your assignment this week is asking you to think about. Because the Renaissance did not just celebrate talent, it celebrated many-sided talent. Now, this brings us to an important figure in your reading this week, Giorgio Vasari. Vasari was a painter and an architect, but he is most famous for writing a book called Lives of the Artists. This book is incredibly important because it helped shape how later generations like us understood Renaissance artists. But Vasari was not just recording facts about these artists. He was constructing a story about greatness. When he writes about Leonardo, he describes him as dazzling, graceful, brilliant, a person gifted in many different fields. In some passage, Leonardo almost sounds superhuman, and that's intentional. Vasari was helping create the image of the Renaissance genius. He was kind of like Leonardo's PR man. He emphasized breadth of talent. He emphasized intellectual power. He emphasized brilliance and originality. In other words, he helped define what people meant when they talked about a Renaissance man. And this is why his writing matters for your assignment this week, because Vasari is showing us what Renaissance culture admired. So when you choose your modern Renaissance person this week, you're doing something very similar to what Vasari was doing. You are asking, who represents intellectual curiosity today? Who moves across different fields? Who seems larger than just one category of achievement? And what does our admiration of those people reveal about our own culture? So when you read Vasari this week, think of him not just as a historian, but as someone who's actually helping construct the very idea of cultural greatness. So this idea connects directly to your assignment, which I've been talking about. You're going to be writing a letter to someone that you consider a modern Renaissance person. But the goal of the assignment is not simply to just pick someone who you admire, who you really like, or you're like, oh, that person's really cool. Instead, I want you to think a little more deeply about what that admiration actually means. Not just who do I like, but questions like, why does this person feel important? What kind of achievements or qualities do they represent? What kind of abilities or talents do they demonstrate? And what does our culture celebrate in them? And are they someone who moves across different fields? Are they someone who blends creativity and analysis? Are they curious about many different parts of the world? In other words, I want you to think about the Renaissance idea of the polymath, the person whose talents and curiosity extend beyond a single discipline. Because when we choose someone as a modern Renaissance person, we are really making a statement about what we think intellectual greatness looks like today. And that makes this assignment not just about a person that you admire, but about the values of your own culture. Now, there is another very important layer to the Renaissance story. Genius does not just float around by itself. It needs support, as I've mentioned. It needs training, it needs materials and opportunity, and that is where patronage comes in. Wealthy families like the Medici supported artists and scholars, and patronage shaped what art was created, who became visible, which talents were developed, and which works were remembered. Art became a form of cultural capital. One of the most famous examples of this is the Medici family in Florence. The Medici were bankers. They were extremely powerful and extremely wealthy, and they invested enormous resources into supporting artists and intellectual life. Now, I want to remind you that before you had these wealthy, powerful banking and trading merchant families, the wealth was usually only belonged to the royal and to the church. So there wasn't this wealthy middle class of people until all of a sudden you had this trade opening up. And of course, it's not no surprise that Florence in Italy would see one of the first of these wealthy families come out of this new tradition. And that, of course, is the Medici. Now, don't get me wrong, they were mixed up in, the church and in politics and in the royal families, but they made their money through merchants and through banking and through trade. And they didn't just fund art simply because they liked pretty paintings. Art functioned as something much bigger. It was a form of cultural capital. Supporting artists helped communicate prestige. It demonstrated sophistication. It showed political influence, religious devotion, and civic pride. In other words, art helped powerful families attach their name to beauty, intelligence, and cultural importance. And this is why patronage mattered so much, because patronage shaped the entire cultural landscape. It influenced what kinds of art were created. It influenced which artists became visible. It influenced whose talents had the chance to develop. And ultimately, it influenced which works of art were remembered by history. So, when we talk about Renaissance genius, we also have to talk about the systems that made that genius possible. And once we start asking those questions, we arrive at another very important issue. Because if opportunity mattered so much, then we have to ask, who actually had access to those opportunities? And that question leads us directly into our next topic, the female artists of the Renaissance. So we know that during this time period, it was all about recognizing the human potential. And if we're going to celebrate the Renaissance human potential, we also have to ask a difficult question, because that's what studying history is all about. What potential was recognized? Whose potential was recognized? And whose potential was limited? The Renaissance is often presented as this grand age of creativity and possibility, an age of extraordinary individuals pushing the limits of human achievement. And in some ways, it absolutely was. But access to that world was not equal. Female artists did exist during the Renaissance. Women were painting, they were drawing, they were studying, and they were contributing to artistic culture. However, many faced major barriers that male artists simply did not ever have to encounter. Women were often excluded from formal workshops. They were rarely admitted into professional guild systems. They had very limited access to training in anatomy, which was considered essential for history painting, which was the most prestigious artistic genre. And because many women were expected to remain within domestic spaces, their opportunities for artistic education were often instructed to private instruction, usually from their fathers or relatives who were already artists. So when we talk about Renaissance creativity, we have to remember that talent was never the issue. Opportunity was. And that brings us directly to the next question. So if the issue was never talent, if it was never about access to education, access to workshops, access to professional networks, commissions, and public recognition, and most importantly, access to cultural memory. Because history is not just about who creates. It is also about who gets recorded, preserved, and remembered. Artists like Sofonisba Anguissola, who became a court painter in Spain, and Platia Nelli, a Florentine nun who produced large religious paintings, remind us that women were actively contributing to Renaissance culture, but many others were overlooked, misattributed, or forgotten by later historians. And this raises a larger humanities question. Who gets included in the official story of culture? Who becomes a great master? And who just disappears into the margins? This is not just an art history question. This is a question about power, memory, and the construction of history itself. And it's something that we're going to come back to often throughout this course, specifically in part 4. So let's talk briefly about your CRAAP test that you have due this week, because this is where your work on the final project really starts to move into the research phase. So at this point in the course, you have already chosen your final project topic, and hopefully you've received approval for that topic. If you haven't, please make sure you go back and edit to make sure that it's approved, because it'll make your life so much easier moving forward. So the first thing I want you to do before moving forward is make sure that your topic has been approved. And once that's confirmed, you're moving into this next stage, research and source evaluation. And that is where the CRAAP test comes in, CRAAP. And at first glance, this assignment might seem very different from everything that we've been discussing in this class. especially this week because, after all, Leonardo da Vinci and the Renaissance polymath sound a lot more exciting than evaluating research sources. But in reality, this assignment is connecting directly to the intellectual spirit of the Renaissance because humanist scholars cared deeply about sources, especially the original sources, right? They returned to ancient texts, they were comparing manuscripts, they were analyzing language carefully, they were asking questions about authorship, credibility, and meaning. In other words, they wanted to understand how knowledge itself is constructed. And that is exactly what the CRAAP test asks you to do. So for this milestone, you are selecting one source that you may want to use in your final project. And then you're going to evaluate it carefully. And you're going to ask questions like, is the information current? Is it relevant to the topic that you're researching? Is the author credible? Is the information accurate? And what is the purpose of the source? These questions might sound simple, but they are actually the foundation of very serious scholarship. Learning to evaluate information carefully is part of developing intellectual discipline. And that discipline, careful reading, careful evaluation, thoughtful interpretation, is deeply connected to Renaissance humanist thinking. So even though this milestone is part of your final project, it really does fit beautifully into this week's theme. Because the Renaissance was not just about creativity and brilliant individuals, it was also about learning how to think critically about knowledge itself. And that is exactly what you're going to begin to practice here. So let's bring all of this together. The Renaissance was a rebirth of classical learning. It was a celebration of human possibility. It was an age of artistic brilliance. It was a world shaped by patronage, competition, wealth, and reputation. And it elevated the image of the extraordinary individual, the person whose curiosity and creativity seemed almost limitless. And it helped define the idea of the polymath, the person who moves across disciplines and refuses to be confined to a single field. But the Renaissance also reminds us that cultural achievements do not exist in isolation. They exist within systems, systems of power, systems of patronage, systems of education and opportunity. And those systems influence who gets to participate in cultural life. And that brings us to the big question I want sitting in the back of your mind this week. Who counts as a Renaissance person today? And if the Renaissance celebrated curiosity, versatility, and intellectual ambition, what do we celebrate now? What kind of achievements do we admire? Who gets labeled as a genius? Who gets public recognition? And what do those choices reveal about our own culture? Because the Renaissance is not just about a historical time period that you're studying in a college humanities class. In many ways, it's a mirror. It helps us see the values that still shape the modern world. I like to think of it as if Leonardo da Vinci was dropped into 2026, where do you think he would invest his time in research? I don't know, probably space, huh? I feel like he would be really into space. Maybe deep sea exploration. So as you move through your work this week, enjoy the beauty of the Renaissance. Admire the brilliance, admire the art, admire the ambition, but don't stop there. Ask what made that world possible. Ask who funded it. Where'd the money come from? And who benefited from it? And who was excluded from it? And ask why the idea of the polymath, the endlessly curious, multi-talented individual, still has such a powerful hold on our imagination today. I'm really excited to see who you choose for your modern Renaissance person this week, and I hope that this helps you see that the Renaissance is not just a period filled with masterpieces, but as a turning point in how we understand human identity, creativity, and potential. So have a wonderful week, and I will see you again soon.